The overarching topic for this week was digital activism. There were two articles, the first of which is Activism or Slacktivism, the Potential and Pitfalls of Social Media in Contemporary Student Activism. First off, the author's main purpose of the article is to let students and faculty know the difference between activism and slacktivism so that they can better pursue actual activism rather than slacktivism, which doesn't really accomplish anything. He also defines slacktivism as political activities that have no impact on real-life political outcomes, but only serve to increase the feel-good factor of the participants. And in dealing with this topic, he goes and talks about various different topics within that. The first being power dynamics, which is a very necessary topic of discussion because activism by necessity involves challenging established powers, especially relevant to students on campus who have to fight either their own student organizations or faculty on campus to push their issues, or, within a broader array of activism, society at large. So he defines these power dynamics into three dimensions, the first of which is that an entity A makes an entity B do something that B wouldn't normally do. Makes sense. The second being that B asks A to do something, but A can choose to ignore B. This one surprised me a little bit because it was never something I had considered really before, or at least going into this reading. But it does make sense that choosing to deny action or withhold action can be just as powerful as giving action or forcing it upon others. It does make sense. The third dimension is slightly more intricate, and that would incorporate hegemonic forces, and that was essentially power restricting options available to the masses in order to reflect the preferences of the dominant social classes. And this one is very relevant in terms of activism, obviously, because activism seeks to, overcome that power option that is restricted to the masses and seeks to overturn the system reflecting the preferences of those in power so that those who aren't in power can still benefit. He used this in a sort of framework of college student activism and combating a lack of diversity on campuses throughout history. And then after he gave those examples, he went into activism versus slacktivism kind of section, in which he defined slacktivism, categorized it, and then started going into details about the differences between it and activism as well as their interactions. The main highlights of this one were the 5 categories of slacktivism, the first being clicktivism, then sympathy, then political, the fourth being charity in a direct capacity, and the fifth being charity as a byproduct of consumption. One of the main takeaways from this was especially clicktivism is often used as a public display of morality, which reminded me of the virtue signaling from the last week's readings. And it also was cited to potentially have immoral consequences, even though its main goal is to make the person look more moral, which is ironic. But the activism and slacktivism do interact kind of strangely, and it's hard to differentiate between the two in many circumstances. One example that the author gave was in a Facebook event where people were called to support same-sex marriage by putting a logo onto their profile picture. And it could be classified as slacktivism, seeing as how that action in and of itself doesn't really do much of anything to help the cause. However, it could also be argued that this strategy was effective because of the widespread acceptance it received, and it was quoted as being effective in challenging social power dynamics and claimed to be an effective form of activism. So the line between activism and slacktivism is very easily blurred, and the author does note this, especially because activism may actually rely on slacktivism in some respects, especially in large activist organizations or movements where slacktivist activities can raise awareness for an issue or can promote various forms of activism among both the people who partake in the slacktivism or those who see those efforts. However, there are also downsides to slacktivism, even though it can be a good thing as well. Often it just has no real benefit to the cause and can be a waste of time, resources, and the energy of the movement's base. And the more public an individual is with slacktivism, the more likely he or she is attempting to promote themselves rather than the actual cause itself, and the less likely that they will take action on a particular issue. And the opposite is actually true, though, for private slacktivism, where if an individual is pursuing slacktivist practices as privately as possible, then it is more likely that they're more motivated to take other action in relation to the cause. Again, kind of reminiscent on self-oriented conspicuous virtue signaling and other-oriented conspicuous virtue signaling. Sort of the same kind of ideal. And then the main focus of the article was the author's 10 premises on the nature of activism to help guide students and faculty into his vision of what activism should be. The first being that student activism involves an intentional, sustained connection to a larger collective. Makes sense. The second being student activism involves developing and exercising power. Activism can't take place without any power whatsoever, so also makes sense. The third being most contemporary student activism utilizes social media, but not all social media usage is activism. And slacktivism is contained on the internet, but not all internet activity is slacktivism. It's a long one, but it's kind of dissectable there. It's very true that most contemporary student activism does utilize social media. I'm currently in a semi-student activism organization myself, and we heavily utilize social media. But not all social media that students attempt to use as activism actually is. A lot of it is slacktivism, but not all of it is basically the crux of what he's saying. And again, as he said, it's hard to tell the difference, but the difference does exist, and not all activity is either activism or slacktivism. The fourth is to be a student activist is a description of a behavior as opposed to identity. Totally agree with that one. Lots of people will say that they're activists, but if they don't take any actions to support that, then they are not activists. They just say that they are. An activist is made by their actions, not by what they say about themselves. The fifth is that student activism must entail a degree of risk, and this risk is mainly incurred when the power structures are challenged, as previously discussed. Whenever you're fighting an entity that is more powerful or in a better position of power than you are, risk is going to be incurred in that. But that is just one of the main focal points of activism, why it's necessary, and one of its primary functions. The sixth is that student activism must be guided by a utopian vision or a vision of what social progress looks like. Seems to make sense. Without that clear vision, without that clear problem that you want to solve and how you want the future to change, movement is probably not going to go much of anywhere. And seventh, hope is foundational for student activism. Also very necessary. If you don't believe and you're not hopeful that your mission can succeed, you're not going to be very motivated in pursuing it. Just on a common sense area there. The eighth is that even though student activism seeks to change the political landscape, it is not the same as political governance or campaigning. I think that's a very important distinction. There are several college organizations that attempt to change the political landscape by partaking in it, by doing various campaigns or supporting various political members of society, but real student activism, I think, should be centered mostly around an issue and solving a problem rather than around supporting a person in politics. And it seems like the author would agree as well. The ninth was that very few people actually engage in student activism. Obviously, I think that's pretty true. Most people do engage in slacktivism rather than activism if they're engaged at all around these issues, because it's far easier to engage in slacktivism. The barrier of entry is a lot lower, much easier for people to fall into that. And the 10th, social media are more, but not entirely, democratic spaces for organic individuals. The main point being there that social media is not nearly as biased as mainstream media outlets. It helps, ordinary people to inject their opinions into society. However, they're still not entirely democratic. There's still some limitations of that, some especially dealing with classes that we'll get into on the next article. So in conclusion, the author says that Too often, student activism focuses on highlighting social wrongs and too little on critical self-examination, which leads to a whole lot of hypocrisy within those student organizations that are attempting to, be activists for certain topics. And he claims that it's important for students and faculty to know the difference between activism and slacktivism. Again, really emphasizes that point. And he also makes one last interesting distinction, that online activism cannot replace personal activism, but it is growing increasingly more important and even necessary in society as everything is turning more digital and more wired into that social media. And within that makes it even more critical to know the difference between activism and slacktivism so that we can pursue activist routes rather than slacktivist ones. The next article was The Digital Activism Gap, How Class and Costs Shape Online Collective Action. This one was a little bit surprising to me because I hadn't really considered it. I'd always taken social media kind of for granted in terms of its being used for, activist purposes. But this paper really challenged my view of that. The article begins with stating how there hasn't been really much research done at all on access to digital activism based on social class, and that available resources make up cost of participation for organizations, and other factors that he classifies as assets make up the cost of participation for digital activism on an individual level. So he really breaks down what is required of both organizations and individuals to participate in this digital activism. And those were, he made sense, but it was also kind of surprising to me that how much was required and how some people did not have access to these things. He first goes into organizations, where it was discussed that organizations will require digital communications equipment and personnel to maintain an online profile in order to have, any kind of presence within the realm of digital activism. And both of these things require lots of money and especially additional staffing for either of them to be optimized. He really stressed that staffing was required. Lots of working class organizations do not have much personnel to dedicate to maintaining their social media presence or their online activism, but it's very necessary. And he also said that organizations also must keep in mind the needs of their individual members. And as far as the individual members goes, again, he says that assets make up their cost of participation. These assets is actually an acronym, ASET, and that stands for Access, Skills, Empowerment, and Tools. Access mainly deals with two things, internet access and time. Both of those things are kind of commodities to a lot of working class individuals. Internet access that we take for granted might not be so readily available to someone who is less fortunate, and they also might not have as much time within their personal life to be pursuing digital activism for various issues when they're more worried about providing for themselves and their families. The S, again, stands for skills, which it takes a considerable deal of skill that a lot of us also take for granted just to operate the internet and to know how to maintain a social media presence. Many people feel like they do not have these skills to be able to do that, and that kind of leads into the E, which is empowerment. A lot of, especially working class individuals, feel that they have a lack of control over when and where they can go online. They do not see themselves as tech people or tech savvy, and they do not believe in their own personal ability to keep up with high volume social medias such as Twitter or YouTube. And all of these things together can tend to lead working class people and organizations away from pursuing digital activism when they don't have these qualifications, these barriers to entry, whereas other higher class organizations and individuals have these in abundance and can take them for granted. So in conclusion, digital activism is not egalitarian as is so readily acceptable, and it improves democratic participation, but not equally across all classes, and there is actually a digital activism gap that the article points out. The main thing is that causes this gap and will make it hard for this gap to disappear is that the middle and upper classes have already entered the digital age with all of the resources, with all of the assets that they need to have a strong digital activism presence, whereas the less fortunate classes did not start out with these things. So while many people assume that the lower classes can catch up to everyone else and everything will equalize out, what those people fail to take into account is the always, improving release of technologies, of platforms, of various different virtual means to get your issues, your opinions out there. And the more of those that are released, the harder it will be for the working class organizations and individuals to catch up. Some of the last things the article talks about is research for the future, advocating that it should go beyond data garnered just on the internet, and especially from only high-profile mobilizations. More precise modeling is needed of how individual class factors and relations affect internet use with digital activism, and that it should more broadly look at how technology use differences and functionalities affect social movement goals, outcomes, and successes. And the intersection of race and class is also critical to further research to better understand variation. Essentially just saying that more research on this topic is necessary so that we can continue to go forward and move in a united direction as a society, and how we can let all of society partake in this, emerging digital activism, so that those who need to be advocated for the most can do that for themselves, rather than have to rely on the goodwill of the upper and middle classes to advocate for them digitally when they want to.